Hey everybody, welcome once again to the Winning Digital Customer Show. I'm Howard Tiersky, and today, I don't know if you realize the important milestone which we passed on Saturday, May 1st. It was a major day if you have a child that had to make a decision about what college to go to, because May 1st was kind of the universal, okay, you've received your college acceptances, now tell us whether you're coming to our school day. And as it happens, I have such a child. My second daughter, Jessica, is a high school senior right now, and she had to make that decision about which college to go to. Thankfully, she was accepted to a number of schools, and she had to make a choice. Now, I thought it was, as I went through as a parent, the experience of trying to help her make that decision, I actually think it's a very interesting study in digital experience and customer experience, and especially as colleges have been really challenged, and it was easy for me to observe this because I had a front row seat, really challenged to figure out how to adapt the recruitment process to the world of COVID. So I wanted to today use this as a kind of a case study. This is not meant to only be about higher education, but rather it's a good example, I think, of the kinds of challenges that many types of businesses have. And I can tell you that I saw quite a number of deficits in what many colleges were doing to try to essentially woo and recruit, and let's just be plain spoken here, and to sell to prospective students and their parents. Some existed COVID, and some of them, I think, were made deficiencies because of some of the tools that they normally have that were taken away from them. So I want to use this as a case study now. And I want to talk a little bit about my own experiences as a parent, but I want to just clarify, I'm not just doing this to rant. I'm going to talk about some of the challenges and points of pain in the process that my daughter and I went through. And let's look at them in the context. I want you to ask yourself, as I talk about some of these issues, could I have similar problems like this in my own business? And my own hypothesis, by the way, is that many of the difficulties that we encountered along the way, that the schools are not fully aware of. My hypothesis is that many of these schools, they're trying, quote unquote, their best. Let me put it another way. They're trying sincerely to create a good experience. And yet, in some areas they're succeeding, but in other areas they're failing. And I'm guessing that they aren't using the proper tools to really understand the customer journey. And when I tell you some of the challenges that we've encountered, I'm guessing you'll see why. And my sort of prescription for these schools is that they need to be engaged in more traditional customer research and customer journey work. And of course, when I say customer, I'm referring to the student and the parents. I work in so many different industries that use a different term for the customer. You work in hospitality and it's the guest. You work in sports and it's the fan. You work in television and it's the viewer, right? So everyone's got a different word for the customer. But in the end, even if you're a school, you might not think of a student as a traditional kind of customer, fine. We can call them a student. But in the end, they're paying you money. You're giving them something of value in return. In my book, that's a customer. And this process of recruiting a student is essentially a sales process. Now, on one level, it is a two-way sales process because, of course, the student has to apply and the school can, of course, decide that that's not a student that they want to admit. But I'm going to focus today mostly on my daughter and my experience after she was accepted to a number of schools. And so, again, I want you to think about this as a sales experience and ask yourself, I wonder if there's similar types of problems or analogous problems that I might have in my own business. And so, but when I say it's a sales experience, let me clarify one thing about the higher education business. One of the things that schools are very focused on are their rankings in places like, US News and World Reports. And there's, of course, many other places where schools are ranked in terms of, like Harvard and Princeton might be number one, and Yale and Columbia, and et cetera, and down. And hopefully the schools I went to, NYU and USC, are somewhere up there, even though I know they're not competing with Harvard and Yale. And then obviously you get all the way down to, community colleges and whatnot. Some of them got to be at the bottom of every list. And colleges, they know that an important part of their long-term success and growth is trying to move up those lists. And so reason I mention this is that one of the criteria that is looked at by prospective students and by rankings is what percentage of the students who are accepted by the school wind up going to that school. In other words, like another criteria that gets looked at is acceptance rate, right? If you're Harvard and you only accept, and I don't know what their acceptance rate is, but you only accept 5% of the people that apply, that makes you look good, right? Obviously, there's a lot of people want to go there, and you're very selective and you only take a few people. But then if you're Harvard and you say, of all the people we accept, 80% of them wind up coming to Harvard. And then if you're another school that says, well, of all the people we accept, only 50% of them or 40% or whatever wind up coming to our school, of course, that's less prestigious. So schools have a great interest in trying to get the students, once they agree to go, once the student is accepted into the school, they have a great interest in trying to get the student to go to the school. And I think that colleges and universities, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experience shortly, but one last sort of point of setup. Colleges and universities, they're very focused on things like direct mail. If you've ever had a child reach that age, where they take the SAT and they're going to be going to college, your mailbox becomes absolutely flooded with brochures from what seems like every school under the sun. Now, I'm sure not every school sent my daughter a brochure, but I would say if we went through a period of the better part of a year where every day there were at least 4 or 5 pieces of mail for Jessica from different schools. So what is that? Multiply that out, maybe 1,500 pieces of direct mail. So a lot of money going in. Some of those direct mail pieces were even customized, the kind of thing it says on the envelope, not just the address, but like the perfect school for Jessica, or you open it up and, these are fairly expensive, some of them direct mail pieces. Some schools sent my daughter like a box. One school sent her a scarf. So this is big business by universities and colleges to try to recruit students, AKA make a sale. And, depending on the school you're going to, if you're looking at private colleges and universities, being in the market now myself and being a tuition payer on my oldest daughter, as well as getting ready to be one on my second daughter, I think my oldest daughter's school is something like $75,000 a year, including, room and board and all that. So you're talking about a 4-year university education with a price tag possibly of $300,000 or thereabouts if you're, not getting scholarships and if you're going to one of the private schools. It doesn't have to be the top private school, though. It doesn't have to be Harvard or an Ivy League school. Many private schools are in a similar range, $75,000, $65,000. So you're talking about a big 6-figure sale that you're trying to make here. Okay. So, historically, as I said, a lot of direct mail comes. And, I think for most kids, that's a pretty good experience. Now, you could argue it may not be great for the environment that so many, direct mail pieces get sent. But I think going through my first 2 daughters, they love getting all that mail. They love feeling like all these colleges were after them. And they looked at a fair number of those pieces. And I definitely think there were some cases where schools got onto their radar that maybe hadn't been because they sent them something great in the mail. So I think that aspect, I think the kind of traditional marketing is something that colleges and universities do well. And I know there's a lot of marketing agencies that their whole business is basically just working with colleges and universities and figuring out how to pitch them to prospective students. I think what I want to talk about today, though, is where my experience, things break down when you get into the actual experience of interacting with a student, where you have a student that's, potentially actually interested in the school. And I want to talk about my second daughter, Jessica, in the context of COVID. But first, let me just talk very briefly about my first daughter, whose name is Rachel. And the reason I want to talk about that is because Rachel went through this process pre-COVID. She's in college now. So when she was choosing which college to go to a couple years ago, of course, it was long before COVID. And one of the things that I observed, and we went around and took her to visit, I don't know how many colleges, probably a dozen, maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 different trips, one to the DC area and one to the Chicago area and others. And, one of the things that I always felt, in some ways it's nice. The colleges traditionally have a whole dog and pony show set up for you. Someone gives you a slide presentation. A student walks you around the campus and usually points out some historical things like which building was the first one that was built and how old it is. And every college seems to have a statue of something or other that's a tradition. And they tell you about the picture, the statue of the husky dog or whatever, and how all the students rub its nose for luck. And they tell you about a few other traditions, and they tell you a little bit about whether they think the food is any good. But to be perfectly honest, these experiences don't really give the student really great insight and information about what it's like to be a student at that school. It's nice to see the campus. The presentations you get from the recruiting people, they tend to be very similar to what you hear from school to school to school. And the walk around tends to contain a lot of information that much of which may not be that helpful to you in making a decision. But I'm sympathetic to the schools because, how much it's very difficult to give the sense of what it's like to go to a school in a 1 hour tour. So that's a pre-existing challenge. And then, of course, what happened with COVID is that became impossible. You couldn't have students in an auditorium and parents in an auditorium listening to a PowerPoint presentation. And for a long time, you didn't want people coming onto your campus. And some of this is resuming now. So you didn't want to invite people to the campus. So the main method for convincing students that the school was a good choice for them was being taken away because now they couldn't do these kinds of tours. And so here was a little bit of our experience. First of all, a lot of what they tried to do was replace tours with different types of Zoom type events or similar web GoToMeeting and that kind of thing. And I think one of the things the schools failed to appreciate, and again, I'm sympathetic because they've been doing the best they can under difficult circumstances, but I can tell you that these Zoom, these webinars that the schools had were problematic for a couple of reasons. The number one reason they were problematic was that the students were spending their entire day in Zoom. And so now you're asking a kid who's instead of going to high school is spending their whole day trying to do high school via their computer to spend another couple of hours in the evening on Zoom with you. And it was not super effective. And I observed this with my daughter, and I observed this in conversations with some of my daughter's friends. They hated the Zooms that the schools did. And of course, if your customer hates the way in which you're selling to them, that's probably not a good sign. And I don't know that the schools really, I can't speak for sure what was on their mind, but I wonder how much they did to really understand whether this was really working for students. But I can tell you from my vantage point in my house, it was not working. And in addition to that, the Zooms, in my experience, were not produced in any particularly interesting or exciting way. I think that if I was advising a college or university right now, and again, I'm not mainly trying to do that here, but ask you to think about this in the context of your own business, I would say to them, how do you make those Zooms really different? How do you make them exciting? I actually wrote a whole book about this called Impactful Online Meetings. So if anyone is interested in that, I go into many ways to make Zoom and similar types of online meetings much more interesting, exciting, engaging, dynamic. And I didn't observe the schools doing any of those things. I don't think they necessarily trained people on how to do that. So it was a very kind of classic, traditional, I'm going to show my slides, I'm going to go through a bunch of material. And that I found to be very, for most kids, boring and just, again, a repeat of what they were experiencing all day long. So I don't think that was very successful. But more to the point, I wonder how many schools really understood that and were actually had their finger on the pulse of what was working and what was not working. In addition, I observed that the process for getting on some of these Zooms was unnecessarily complex. One of the schools that my daughter was very enthusiastic about, although it was not the school she ultimately chose, was George Washington University. And after she was accepted there, they had a series of Zooms, and she wanted to participate, but you had to register for the Zoom. And maybe it wasn't Zoom, maybe it was another technology, I can't remember. And then they had to send you like a special code to get into the thing. And in any case, like the first one we tried to do was a situation where she registered only like a half hour before the actual event, which you wouldn't think would be a big deal because as we understood, you don't normally think about a Zoom as a thing. You need to get an advanced reservation far in advance, like it's a Broadway show, right? But actually, she sent in her, okay, I want to come message a half hour before the Zoom started, and we got nothing back. So she was wanting to participate. Here you have a customer that wants to maybe buy your $300,000 product and is saying, yes, I want to participate in the sales call. And yet, when we tried to get in, it seemed like we had missed the window. And so then we started emailing. My wife and I were like, oh, no, we really want to do this. Bottom line is eventually she got in about halfway through because we emailed like every recruiting email that we could find for George Washington University. But the point is that, here's what you should do, right? If you're having a big Zoom like that, you want to have somebody watching the email box, right? So if someone's having difficulty getting into your sales presentation, you want to make that easy. You want to make sure that you're removing every possible obstacle for the student who or parent with a checkbook, right, who wants to get into your session. And again, I'm guessing that there wasn't somebody at that university thinking, should we pay some students $10 an hour to sit there and help people if they have trouble getting in? Nah, I don't think we should spend that. I don't think we should spend the $10. If they don't register far enough in advance, to hell with them, they're going to miss the sales presentation. I doubt that was their thinking. But I think they just weren't probably thinking about it. And this kind of goes to the main theme, and I'm going to give you a few more examples of my thesis here, which is that they just aren't studying and understanding when they try to put these processes in place for a modified form of recruiting. What is the actual customer experience? And this is why the process of actually studying and understanding when you create a customer experience, what that customer's experience actually is and what their points of pain are is so essential, because obviously you can be turning away customers unintentionally. So let's just talk about a few. By the way, one of the things they did do well was they made replays available. And most of these schools, after they had these sessions, you could watch the replays. The replays weren't necessarily that interesting because they tended to be very canned PowerPointy type things, but nevertheless, at least they were available. So let's talk a little bit about on-campus tours. That was really a mixed bag. There were some schools that you actually could sign up and do an on-campus tour. My daughter Jessica did do one at Sarah Lawrence. There were other schools where they didn't permit they didn't even allow you to come on campus. And there were other schools that didn't permit on-campus tours, but where we were able to find somebody through sort of calling around and whatnot who could give us a tour. But let me just tell you first that some of the campuses tried to have virtual tours of one sort or another, and several of them had websites that were intended to allow a student to kind of think about, imagine one of those museum tour guides where you walk around from area to area and it explains something to you. By and large, and we tried these at 3 or 4 different schools, they did not work well at all. And I think they were overly engineered. Some of them had animated characters, and some of them had a person talking blue screened in front of something. And many of them weren't really mobile friendly. It was almost like they were meant to run on a desktop computer, but they didn't think about the fact that you'd be walking around the campus with your phone. And I can tell you the one that worked the best for me, and this is kind of ironic. The one that worked best for us was a PDF. All the ones that tried to do something sophisticated and digital inevitably failed, either because we couldn't get a GPS signal properly, or the technology just wasn't really ready for prime time, or at least hadn't been thoroughly enough tested. There's no reason in my mind that you couldn't have a tour tool that says, okay, I can tell from GPS, you're now at this location, look in front of you, you can see this, now turn to your right. That absolutely seems like something that should be possible. And maybe what these schools raced to get something out because of COVID and they didn't have enough time to make it great. Or maybe they just hired somebody to build something and didn't really test it as a customer. I don't know. But what I would say that these schools need to do, and I'm speaking not just to schools, but to you and whatever your business is make sure that you are experiencing and you're actually observing people who are customers or representative of your customer target groups, experiencing the actual sales tools that you're putting out there. Because I can tell you in this case, we found universally across schools that in general, they clearly put a lot of effort and money into these tools, but they didn't work well at all. And basically we weren't able to use them. We just gave up, at some universities and just put our phones back in our pocket and just wandered around mindlessly trying to get a sense of the school. The one that worked the best, as I said, was a PDF. And interestingly, the school said in the emails that they sent us that we could come to the recruiting office and get a printed campus tour if we wanted to take one. And then we showed up and the door was locked and it said the recruiting office is closed due to COVID. So this goes to another point, which we repeatedly experienced as well, which is inconsistent messaging. And again, I'm sympathetic to the fact that COVID is a little bit of a fluid situation, but this was an email we'd received only a few days earlier. So I think it was probably not necessarily one of those types of situations, but rather, I'm really not sure. But again, we repeatedly observed this thing where it seemed like when you arrived on campus, if you arrived on campus, the schools weren't really ready with a clear solution for you. And what would have been a simple solution? A sign on the exterior that said, hey, welcome. Here's almost like on Halloween when we all put our candy out and said, okay, kids, we're leaving a bowl of candy, take it, or something. I mean, I think there's many alternative things that could be done, and hopefully they won't be necessary from a COVID perspective. But if we think about our business in general, the core point here was the world changed, customer needs changed, new constraints and restrictions were placed on these schools. And that is not an unusual situation, right? Things change in the world. And when you try new things, you have to make sure that they're thoroughly tested, because it felt to us like many of these things were not well tested. And, I think the other thing is be careful not to over-engineer. In this case, a simpler solution, the one that we did, the one that was the PDF, they did not make the printed version available to us, but we were able to find the PDF ourselves through our own effort and research. We felt when we were going to these campuses like we were kind of on our own, and it was up to us to work hard, to Google around, to try to find the information, or to use our network of relationships and contacts to find somebody who could give us a tour. So that's great if you have a customer that's that determined, right? Like we were. It's great if your customer says, you know what, even if your sales process is weak, even if you haven't provided me the tools that make it easy for me to evaluate your product, darn it, I'm going to find a way anyway. I'm going to research it on myself. I'm going to find somebody who's used your product. I'm going to talk to them. That's great if your customers are that determined. But the risk is that most of your customers may not be that determined. And the result may well be that you lose customers who say, okay, I can't make sense of this. Or there's a competitor who makes it easier for them to make that analysis, and they just wind up with that competitor. One of the other things that we that really annoyed us a great deal, and is I think an important principle to bear in mind when you're dealing with customers, especially when you're selling something really important and high ticket like a college education, is honesty. I'm not going to say which school this is, but we were calling around to the schools we were intending to visit to try to find out if they had any kind of tours. And this one school told us, due to COVID, there were absolutely no tours. No tours are being given. There's nothing you can sign up for. We were like, we're willing to be flexible about when we come. If there's any way to get us on a tour, isn't it possible? Because I wanted my daughter to have the best possible information. Notwithstanding what I said before about the fact that these tours often aren't as useful as you'd like, they're better than nothing, right? And so they basically told us nothing's happening. There are no tours. So we went to the campus by ourselves. We walked around. We tried to make the best of us. And what do we stumble across while we're doing that? A tour, right? A clearly organized tour. Everyone in the tour had stickers from the university. There was someone leading the tour. Clearly the school was giving tours. They had simply, they told us there were no tours, and we came across a tour. And so I said very nicely to the tour guide, hey, my daughter's, here to evaluate the school. Could she join the tour? No, they tell me. You have to have registered for the tour. So again, I'm not here to rant, but think about the customer experience there. I'm thinking about entrusting this school with my daughter's education, and they're lying to me. Now, why are they lying to me? I don't know. If I had to guess, I'm guessing, and I really don't know. Maybe this was a tour only for students admitted to a certain program. Maybe this was a tour only for the top 1% of the students that were admitted, and my daughter didn't hit that threshold. I don't know. Maybe they ran out of slots in all their tours, and somebody thought it was better to tell people there are no tours than to tell people the truth, which is that, sorry, we have tours, but they're all full. I don't know. But all I can tell you is that's a good example of, you might think that makes sense, but then the customer experience, you want to just think, well, what's the customer experience when the parent and the student come on campus and they see tours and they know they've been misled? So just another example, you could probably get the theme here, which is that I just don't think the schools, when they define these tools and policies, really had a closed feedback loop to really see how is this affecting the actual, student parent experience? How is this affecting essentially the sales experience? And I'll tell you one last funny story that I don't think has anything to do with COVID. Well, actually, I take it back. It does have to do with COVID. And again, it goes to the question of thinking about what's the customer experience you're delivering. One of the last schools that we looked at was Sarah Lawrence, lovely school. We went, and thankfully, thank you, Sarah Lawrence, they were giving tours. We could actually sign up and get a tour at Sarah Lawrence. And not only that, but when we showed up, it was a private tour. It's a small school, so I imagine they're trying to show parents and students that you get that kind of personal attention at a school like Sarah Lawrence. So we go to Sarah Lawrence and we get our own personal tour guide, which was awesome. And she was a lovely girl. Here's the problem. She was a sophomore, but she was a transfer student. So this was her first year at Sarah Lawrence. And because it's been COVID most of the year, she's had to do most of her classes at Sarah Lawrence by Zoom. So the tour kind of went like this. This is our student athletic center. Inside, there's a pool and a whole bunch of workout machines. So I'm told. I've never been inside. And then this is the library. There's all kinds of books in there and student study, but I haven't actually gone inside because of COVID. The library's been closed all year. And so essentially, the only place this girl had been inside of was the dorms and the cafeterias. And again, it's like, okay, if you're going to bring people to campus and try to give them a tour, and again, I give props to Sarah Lawrence for giving tours, you want to make sure that the people who are giving the tours have the experience that's going to enable that tour to be worthwhile. In this case, I'm sure the student did the best she could, but if you have never been inside any of the buildings, and we're not allowed to go inside the buildings, you're going to be limited in your ability to really convey the full sense of the school, especially because obviously you're not trying to sell the school in terms of the during COVID experience, but the post-COVID experience, which hopefully is more similar to the pre-COVID experience. So hopefully this hasn't just seemed like a rant about my daughter and my experience in helping her select a school. I wouldn't have shared it for only that reason, but I actually think it's important. And I think when we all have these experiences as customers, it can sometimes be easy to think when you have a bad customer experience, just to think badly of the company that is delivering that experience. In fact, that's what most customers do. And that's why it's so important that we focus on making our customer experiences as positive as they can be, to not create those negative emotions which harm our brand. But what I always do, because I'm professional in this area, is I always try to think, well, what's the root cause of this? And is this a root cause that I could be susceptible to in my own business? If I just think that companies that have a bad customer experience might either just not care or be stupid, and I think to myself, well, I do care and I'm not stupid, and therefore I'm not going to be prone to these problems, that's a way oversimplification. Many companies that do care and are not stupid have major customer experience problems because they haven't taken the steps to do the kind of research to really understand what happens on the ground. There's a concept of what's meant to happen. We'll have these Zooms. Prospective students will come on the Zooms. They'll come on campus. They'll use our cool app to do a personal, to guided tour through the campus, et cetera, et cetera. But then when students try to do these things for one reason or another, they just don't work well. And that knowledge and insight is super important. I'm not saying everything in your business doesn't work well, by the way, but if key components of your sales process, for example, are just not connecting and not clicking, that's information you must have. So in my book, Winning Digital Customers, The Antidote to Irrelevance, I talk in great depth about different methods of doing customer research, things anybody can do. You can hire an outside company to do this type of work, mine, for example, but you can also engage in it yourself. And my book is meant to help provide some principles and practices and methodologies and even tools, because it comes with downloadable tools to help you plan and execute that kind of customer research yourself. And I really think it's critical that companies be doing it all the time, but it's even more critical now with COVID, as we see with the universities and colleges, because you've had to make some quick, adaptations of your customer experience. And it may be that those quick things that you did, even though they were the best you could do under the circumstances, have flaws and problems. They probably do, let's face it, because you had to put them in place so quickly. And also customer needs have changed and are continuing to change. We went into COVID, and now as we're just starting to come out of COVID, it's a continuously changing thing, what customers' needs actually are. And so it's more critical than ever in this time of rapid change in customer needs and rapid change in regulations that we operate under in our businesses as well, that we're engaging in that kind of ongoing customer research. And I don't know exactly what was going on the inside of these colleges and universities, but they appeared to me like organizations that just were underinvesting in this kind of customer experience. And when you're selling a $300,000 product, obviously it doesn't take too many, lost sales to pay for a little bit of customer research. And that would be my prognosis or my prescription for colleges and universities, and probably for your business as well. So I'll close with this. My daughter did finally decide what school to go to. She's going to the University of Vermont. Not to undermine my whole message here, not because the University of Vermont did better than any of these other schools in terms of the recruiting stuff. I don't think they particularly did. And as a matter of fact, They didn't offer any kind of campus tours, for example, but it's an amazing school, a beautiful town, fantastic reputation. And because we knew people that were connected with the university, we were able to get them totally outside the realm of the university's system to make sure my daughter had all the information that she needed. And I'm really excited for her. I think it's going to be a fantastic college experience for her. Hopefully a lot better than the experience she had selecting a college. So hopefully this has been a helpful, interesting kind of case study for you. And I'd encourage you to think about whether you could be making these kinds of problems in your customer experiences and not even realizing it, as I expect a lot of these colleges and universities haven't been fully realizing it either. With that, thank you as always for watching and for listening. And I look forward to seeing you next time on the Winning Digital Customer Show.